The Siege of Odessa, 1941, was a pivotal battle during World War II. Odessa, a strategic port city on the Black Sea, was a crucial target for both Axis and Soviet forces. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Alongside German advances in the north and center, Romania, Germany's key ally in southeastern Europe, was tasked with securing the southern flank, which included the Soviet territory of Bessarabia and the vital city of Odessa. Odessa held immense military and symbolic importance. It was the headquarters of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, a major transportation hub, and a center of Soviet resistance in southern Ukraine. Its port facilities, rail connections, and defensive installations made it a formidable obstacle. Furthermore, the Soviet government had invested heavily in its fortifications during the 1930s, anticipating its strategic value in the event of war. Romania, eager to reclaim territories lost to the Soviet Union in 1940, including Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, was driven by both nationalistic fervor and alliance obligations to the Third Reich. Under the command of Marshal Ion Antonescu, Romanian forces formed the bulk of the Axis offensive in the south. Germany provided limited assistance in this region, focusing its efforts on the central and northern sectors of the front. Thus, the burden of the Odessa campaign fell primarily on Romanian shoulders. By mid-July 1941, Axis forces had recaptured Bessarabia and advanced toward the Dniester River. Soviet troops, reinforced by elements of the Black Sea Fleet and regional reserves, prepared to defend Odessa. The defense of the city was entrusted to the separate coastal army under the command of Major General Georgy Sofronov, supported by Vice Admiral Filip Oktyabrski, who commanded naval forces in the area. The defenders were composed of a mix of regular army units, naval personnel, local militia, and NKVD troops. The initial Axis plan was to encircle and rapidly overwhelm the city before Soviet forces could consolidate their defenses. However, this proved overly ambitious. Odessa's defenders utilized a combination of fortified trenches, barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, and natural terrain to create a multi-layered defensive perimeter. The city's coastal location also allowed the Soviet Navy to provide artillery support and resupply via the sea, complicating Axis logistics and prolonging the campaign. Fighting commenced in earnest in early August 1941. Romanian troops launched a series of assaults aimed at breaching the Soviet lines and isolating Odessa. Progress was slow and costly. The defenders employed stubborn resistance, counterattacks, and extensive use of artillery. The terrain around Odessa, featuring ravines, vineyards, and open steppe, offered both sides tactical advantages and challenges, depending on the sector of the front. As the siege unfolded, both sides suffered mounting casualties. Romanian forces, initially confident of a quick victory, found themselves bogged down in prolonged and grueling combat. Supply lines stretched thin, and morale began to falter. For the Soviets, the ability to hold Odessa against superior numbers became a symbol of defiance and national pride. The defense of the city was heavily publicized by Soviet media, which portrayed Odessa as a bastion of heroism and determination. In these opening weeks, the strategic implications of the siege became clearer. While the Axis hoped to eliminate a Soviet stronghold and secure control over the northern Black Sea coast, the Soviets aimed to tie down Romanian forces, delay the Axis advance, and inflict heavy losses. The battle for Odessa quickly escalated into one of the most intense urban and coastal engagements on the southern front in 1941. By the end of August, Romanian units had reached the city's outer defenses, but the prospect of a quick victory had vanished. Odessa's defenders had proven resilient, and the Soviet Navy maintained its lifeline to the city. The siege had become a test of endurance, strategy, and willpower, one that neither side could afford to lose easily. This first phase of the siege set the stage for the brutal and drawn-out battle that would follow. It highlighted the strategic importance of Odessa, the determination of its defenders, and the difficulties faced by the Romanian military in conducting large-scale offensive operations without substantial German support. The coming weeks would see intensified fighting, changes in tactics, and further entrenchment of both forces as the siege deepened. As August wore on, the situation around Odessa grew increasingly complex. The Romanian High Command recognized that the initial hopes for a swift breakthrough had failed. Instead, they found themselves locked in a slow, attritional struggle against well-prepared Soviet defenses. The city's defenders not only resisted effectively, but also launched coordinated counterattacks, often under the cover of naval gunfire from the Black Sea Fleet. The Romanian Fourth Army, under General Nicolae Ciuperca, bore the brunt of the offensive. Comprised of several corps and reinforced with artillery and engineer units, it attempted to breach the Soviet defensive rings around Odessa through concentrated attacks on key sectors. These operations, however, were hampered by a lack of coordination, insufficient intelligence, and limited air support. Romanian infantry divisions frequently encountered stiff resistance in the form of well-camouflaged machine gun nests, minefields, and pre-sighted artillery zones. On the Soviet side, the separate coastal army demonstrated remarkable cohesion. General Safronov directed a layered defense strategy that combined trench networks, mobile reserves, and concentrated artillery batteries. The defenders adapted quickly to Axis tactics, employing deception, sudden local counteroffensives, and mobile units that shifted to plug vulnerable points. The NKVD detachments, often feared and politically motivated, played a critical role in maintaining discipline and preventing panic during Romanian breakthroughs. Naval support remained one of the most decisive advantages for the Soviets. The Black Sea Fleet, operating from bases in Sevastopol and Novorossiysk, provided not only artillery bombardment against Axis positions, but also continuous supply shipments to Odessa. Minesweepers, submarines, and destroyers ensured that Romanian attempts to blockade the port were unsuccessful. The Sea Lifeline allowed the Soviet command to rotate troops, evacuate wounded, and replenish ammunition and provisions, an advantage the Romanians could not negate. Despite mounting losses and growing exhaustion among its troops, the Romanian command remained committed to the siege. Pressured by political expectations and the desire to prove Romania's value as an Axis ally, Marshal Antonescu pushed for renewed offensives. The result was a series of bloody engagements in late August and early September, particularly in the areas north and northeast of the city. One of the fiercest battles took place near the village of Dalnik, southwest of Odessa. Romanian forces attempted to cut off Soviet supply lines and encircle the city's southern defenses. The terrain, a mix of gullies and cultivated fields, made large-scale maneuvers difficult. The Soviets entrenched themselves in depth, using field fortifications and fortified farmsteads to repel repeated Romanian advances. After days of heavy shelling and infantry assaults, the Romanian units managed to seize parts of the forward lines, but failed to achieve a breakthrough. Romanian artillery played a significant role in these operations. However, its effectiveness was limited by the scarcity of shells and poor coordination with infantry units. German liaison officers, though present, reported concerns about Romania's ability to maintain pressure without sustained logistical and technical support. German High Command remained reluctant to divert significant forces to the Odessa front, focusing instead on operations around Kiev and Smolensk. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on Romanian soldiers began to manifest. The siege turned into a prolonged and brutal experience. Long periods of exposure to heat, dust, disease, and artillery bombardment weakened morale. Letters recovered from Romanian troops later revealed exhaustion, fear, and disillusionment. Casualty rates rose steadily, and medical services were overwhelmed. Units that had expected a quick advance now found themselves entrenched in a grinding war of position. Odessa's civilian population, estimated at over 600,000 before the war, also faced dire circumstances. Many residents had fled during the initial stages of the invasion, but a significant number remained. They were drawn into the defense effort, digging trenches, manning observation posts, and working in supply depots. Soviet propaganda emphasized the unity between soldiers and civilians, fostering a sense of collective resistance. At the same time, the NKVD enforced strict control over the population, cracking down on any signs of dissent or panic. By early September, it became clear to both sides that Odessa would not fall quickly. The front lines hardened, artillery duels intensified, and the fighting became a daily contest for survival. The Soviets continued to fortify the city's interior lines, preparing for a potential breakthrough that never came. The Romanians, stretched thin and facing mounting pressure, began to call for German assistance in the form of aerial support and advisory units. This second phase of the siege marked a turning point. The campaign shifted from an attempted rapid assault to a war of attrition, where control of each ridge, trench, and road junction came at the cost of hundreds of lives. The longer the siege dragged on, the more it drained Romanian manpower and resources, an outcome that would eventually shape the broader dynamics of the Eastern Front in the south. By mid-September 1941, the siege of Odessa had become a deeply entrenched stalemate. The Romanian Fourth Army remained committed to capturing the city, but the prolonged nature of the siege was exposing critical weaknesses in their operational capabilities. Supply shortages, dwindling morale, and a growing casualty toll all began to weigh heavily on both the Romanian command structure and the soldiers on the front lines. For the Soviets, however, each day the city held out was a tactical success, tying down large Axis forces and demonstrating the resilience of the Soviet southern defenses. Marshal Antonescu, under increasing pressure from both domestic political forces and his German allies, ordered a new phase of assaults aimed at breaking the deadlock. These renewed attacks focused particularly on the northern and eastern sectors of the city's defenses, where Romanian commanders believed they had identified weaknesses. Despite these assumptions, the Soviet positions had been significantly reinforced over the previous weeks. Minefields had been expanded, trenches deepened, and artillery units repositioned for maximum coverage. A critical factor during this period was the growing involvement of Soviet naval infantry. These Marines, many of whom had been transferred from the Black Sea Fleet, were trained for close-quarters combat and urban warfare. Their presence was felt most intensely during Romanian attempts to storm key strongpoints such as the Lustdorf Heights and the area around Chabanca. In both locations, Romanian gains were minimal and came at a high cost. Naval infantry units frequently launched nighttime raids to disrupt Romanian preparations, destroy artillery emplacements, and gather intelligence from the front. In the air, Soviet control remained tenuous but crucial. Though outmatched in numbers by the Axis, Soviet pilots operated from makeshift airfields along the coast and frequently conducted harassment bombing missions against Romanian troop concentrations. Romanian air units, including the newly established Air Corps, attempted to counter these efforts, but coordination with ground operations remained inconsistent. German Luftwaffe units operating in southern Ukraine occasionally supported Romanian efforts, but they were often redirected to higher priority theaters, such as the Battle of Kiev, which was reaching its climax. Throughout early and mid-September, Axis forces made a number of costly advances into outlying suburbs and defensive outposts, only to be driven back or halted by stiff Soviet resistance. The geography of the area contributed to the difficulty. Deep ravines, dry riverbeds, and vineyards offered natural defensive advantages to the Soviet forces. Attempts to advance through the open terrain near the Dniester Liman were met with devastating artillery fire from concealed Soviet batteries. Despite the continued failure to breach the city, Romanian propaganda portrayed the siege as a noble effort and emphasized supposed victories to maintain public morale. In truth, the lack of progress was beginning to cause serious concern within Romanian military circles. General Nicolae Ciuperca, commander of the Fourth Army, voiced his objections to the ongoing attritional approach and advocated for a temporary operational pause to regroup and reorganize. His suggestions were overruled by Antonescu, who dismissed concerns as defeatism. This internal disagreement would later have major consequences. Inside the city, the Soviet command was growing increasingly confident. Though casualties were mounting and supplies were being strained, Odessa's defenders had succeeded in stalling a numerically superior force. Morale among Soviet troops was bolstered by regular shipments of ammunition, reinforcements, and food brought in by sea convoys. The Black Sea Fleet maintained a near-daily schedule of logistical runs under the cover of night or coastal artillery, making interdiction nearly impossible for Axis forces. Civilians, too, played a growing role in the defense of Odessa. Thousands of volunteers were organized into worker battalions, tasked with repairing damage, reinforcing fortifications, and assisting in logistics. Despite the ever-present threat of artillery and aerial bombardment, many residents refused evacuation and actively supported the military effort. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medical facilities had to be set up in schools, theaters, and churches. Soviet authorities carefully managed the narrative within the city, framing Odessa as a fortress of socialist resolve against fascist aggression. Meanwhile, the strategic cost for Romania was becoming increasingly severe. The extended siege was consuming vast amounts of ammunition, fuel, and manpower, resources that were badly needed elsewhere on the front. German command was growing impatient with Romania's inability to secure Odessa swiftly, and some German officers began to question the wisdom of entrusting such a critical objective to an ally whose military was proving underprepared for protracted operations. By late September, nearly 2 months into the siege, a quiet acknowledgement emerged within the Romanian High Command. If Odessa was to fall, it would require more than frontal assaults and conventional tactics. The city was not just a military target, but had become a powerful symbol of Soviet resistance. Its fall was essential for consolidating Axis control over the Black Sea region and securing supply routes through southern Ukraine. And yet, despite weeks of intense combat, it remained defiantly out of reach. The failure to deliver a decisive blow not only endangered Romania's standing with the Germans, but also threatened to derail the broader southern strategy of the Axis advance into the Soviet Union. Thus, the siege of Odessa, once envisioned as a brief campaign, was now evolving into one of the most prolonged and bloody confrontations of the war's early southern front. As September gave way to October, the toll of the siege was beginning to show clearly on both the attackers and the defenders. The Romanian army, committed beyond its logistical capabilities, struggled to maintain momentum. Despite weeks of intense combat, they had failed to break through the Soviet perimeter or sever Odessa's vital sea supply routes. At the same time, the Soviets were beginning to feel the pressure of an extended siege, with stretched resources, mounting casualties, and signs of fatigue among both troops and civilians. Still, the defenders remained defiant. The strategic urgency for Romania to end the siege grew ever more pressing. German forces were advancing rapidly elsewhere in Ukraine, closing in on key cities like Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk. The fall of Kiev in late September had freed up German divisions, and Romanian leaders feared being sidelined or overshadowed in the Axis hierarchy if they failed to secure Odessa soon. The political stakes were high. Odessa had to be taken to justify Romania's sacrifices and to secure its reputation as a reliable Axis partner. In response, Marshal Antonescu approved a new comprehensive plan aimed at overwhelming Odessa's defenses through a coordinated, multi-axis assault. The revised plan involved simultaneous thrusts from the north and east, combined with intensified artillery bombardment and increased air activity. Romanian engineers worked tirelessly to prepare the battlefield, laying communication lines, digging trenches, and assembling pontoon bridges to facilitate troop movements across ravines and canals. However, the ambitious nature of the operation once again outpaced Romania's logistical reality. On October 2nd, the Romanian Fourth Army launched one of the largest coordinated offensives of the entire siege. Infantry divisions, supported by artillery and armored vehicles, stormed Soviet trenches in the eastern sectors near Chabanka and Vigoda. In the north, they attempted to flank Soviet positions near the Kuyalnik estuary, seeking to drive a wedge between the defenders and their rear support areas. Romanian troops advanced under the cover of smoke screens and heavy shelling, managing in some areas to breach the first line of Soviet fortifications. But the Soviet response was immediate and fierce. General Sofronov, anticipating the offensive, had held reserves in depth and rapidly redeployed units to plug the gaps. Artillery strikes targeted Romanian assembly areas and disrupted command posts. Soviet naval infantry and Red Army regulars counterattacked with ferocity, engaging Romanian forces in brutal close quarters, combat in trenches, and ruined villages. In several instances, entire Romanian platoons were wiped out in hours of fighting without gaining ground. Despite their determination, Romanian forces suffered heavy casualties. Units such as the 1st and 3rd Infantry Divisions reported battalion-level losses, and entire companies were rendered combat ineffective within days. Medical services were overwhelmed, with field hospitals operating in tents and makeshift shelters. Romanian soldiers, lacking proper winter gear and already exhausted from months of siege warfare, began to show signs of psychological and physical collapse. Compounding Romanian difficulties was the increasing instability within their command structure. General Nicolae Țiupercă, disillusioned by what he saw as wasteful and ineffective tactics, openly criticized the high command's strategy. His suggestions for a temporary operational halt and re-evaluation of objectives were met with hostility by Antonescu, who viewed any sign of hesitation as unacceptable. In early October, Țiupercă was relieved of his command and replaced with General Iosif Iacobici. This change, intended to restore confidence and aggression, instead contributed to further disarray within the Romanian leadership. Meanwhile, Soviet command in Odessa began to contemplate a broader strategic picture, with German forces advancing rapidly toward Crimea and threatening to encircle the Black Sea coast. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, realized that holding Odessa indefinitely was no longer viable. Still, Soviet commanders were determined to extract the highest possible cost from the Axis before any withdrawal. The defenders intensified local counterattacks and began laying elaborate demolition charges throughout the city in preparation for a potential evacuation. Naval operations during this phase remained critical. The Black Sea Fleet continued to supply Odessa, with destroyers and cargo ships braving Axis artillery and aircraft to land reinforcements and evacuate the wounded. Coastal artillery batteries, protected by concrete bunkers and camouflage positions, shelled Romanian staging areas, preventing them from massing troops unchallenged. At night, Soviet boats launched raids along the coastline, destroying Romanian fuel depots and sabotaging pontoon bridges. Soviet morale, while strained, remained high compared to the attackers. Propaganda within the city painted the siege as a heroic struggle against fascism, and numerous stories circulated about the bravery of individual soldiers and civilians. Women worked in munitions factories, children delivered food to the front lines, and elderly citizens dug trenches alongside conscripts. This image of collective resistance was carefully cultivated by the NKVD and local party officials, and it served to strengthen the cohesion of Odessa's population under siege. The city itself bore increasing scars from the relentless fighting. Large portions of the industrial and port districts were damaged by shelling. Fires, smoke, and the distant thump of artillery became a constant backdrop to daily life. Hospitals were overcrowded, food rations were tightened, and power shortages became frequent. Yet through all this, Odessa continued to resist, its defenses battered but unbroken, its will intact. As the 4th week of October approached, Axis commanders faced a grim reality. Despite launching the most intense and costly assault of the campaign, they had failed once more to take the city. The Romanian army was nearing exhaustion, and even with German encouragement, there was no clear path to success through continued frontal assaults. The prospect of winter loomed, and with it, the risk that Odessa might remain out of Axis hands altogether if new tactics were not employed, or if the Soviets did not withdraw voluntarily. By mid-October 1941, the siege had entered its final phase. The Romanian army, exhausted and depleted, continued to maintain pressure on Odessa, but progress had stalled. The city had held out for over 2 months against sustained attacks, and its defenders had inflicted heavy casualties on the besieging forces. Yet, behind the walls of Odessa, a strategic decision was being made, one that would shape the outcome of the siege and determine the next movements on the southern front. Soviet High Command, Stavka, had come to a difficult conclusion. Although the defense of Odessa had been a remarkable success in terms of delaying Axis forces and tying down large enemy formations, the broader strategic situation had shifted dramatically. German troops were rapidly advancing toward Crimea, threatening Sevastopol and the rear areas of the Black Sea coast. Holding Odessa any longer risked encirclement and the loss of irreplaceable troops and equipment. Thus, in early October, the Soviet leadership issued a secret directive. Odessa was to be evacuated. The decision was made with the utmost secrecy. Only the highest-ranking officers within the separate coastal army and the Black Sea Fleet were informed at first. The primary goal of the evacuation was to preserve the fighting strength of the defenders and redeploy them to Crimea, where a major German offensive was anticipated. Odessa's defense had already fulfilled its strategic purpose. It had delayed Axis advances, weakened Romanian military capacity, and served as a powerful symbol of Soviet resistance. Now, it was time to shift focus to the next major battleground. Planning for the evacuation was a monumental task. Over 8,000 military personnel, tens of thousands of civilians, vast quantities of equipment, and large stocks of ammunition needed to be transported across the Black Sea under the constant threat of Axis attack. Vice Admiral Filip Oktyabrski assumed overall command of the operation. The Black Sea Fleet was tasked with organizing convoys, securing naval corridors, and coordinating with ground forces to ensure an orderly withdrawal. Preparations began under the cover of night. Units were gradually pulled back from outer defensive lines to inner sectors, giving the impression of a tactical redeployment rather than retreat. Heavy equipment that could not be transported was destroyed or sabotaged to prevent capture. Civilian workers assisted in dismantling key installations and laying explosive charges in critical infrastructure, bridges, docks, warehouses, and fuel depots. Soviet engineers rigged entire neighborhoods with explosives to deny the enemy any usable facilities. Meanwhile, fighting continued along the front. Romanian forces remained unaware of the evacuation plan and continued launching limited offensives in hopes of finding a breakthrough. These attacks, while fierce, lacked the strength and coordination to breach Soviet defenses. The defenders, now operating with the knowledge that they would soon leave the city, fought with determination, inflicting further losses on the attackers while buying time for the evacuation to proceed. Between October 16th and October 20th, the full evacuation began. Using destroyers, transports, and smaller vessels, Soviet forces began the massive undertaking of moving men and materials from Odessa to Sevastopol and other Crimean ports. The operation was conducted largely at night to avoid detection by Axis reconnaissance aircraft. The coordination between land and sea units was exceptional. Convoys were loaded rapidly, naval gunfire covered embarkation zones, and smokescreens were deployed to obscure movements. The scale and efficiency of the evacuation surprised even the Soviet commanders. By October 20th, the bulk of Soviet forces had been withdrawn. Rear guard units continued to hold defensive positions around the port and the city center, fending off Romanian probing attacks. These troops were among the last to board vessels, leaving the city only hours before Axis troops began entering its outer suburbs. The final stage of the evacuation was marked by destruction. Soviet engineers detonated key installations as they left. Military headquarters, communication centers, warehouses, and rail yards were all destroyed. Fires spread across the port district, and explosions rocked the city through the night. The goal was clear: deny the enemy any operational advantage from capturing Odessa intact. On October 16th, Romanian units entered the outskirts of the city cautiously. Expecting strong resistance, they advanced slowly, wary of mines and booby traps. To their surprise, they encountered little opposition. By October 17th, Romanian forces had entered the city proper. The Soviet forces were gone, the defenses abandoned, and much of the infrastructure in ruins. Despite finally taking Odessa, the Romanian victory was bittersweet. The city had not been taken by force but abandoned after a long and costly siege. Over 9,000 Romanian casualties had been suffered during the operation, including more than 17,000 dead. The city's defenses had held firm for 73 days, and the garrison had escaped largely intact. For Romania, the cost in blood and resources far exceeded the value of the conquest. For the Soviets, the defense of Odessa was a rare success in a year, otherwise marked by devastating retreats. The Romanian occupation of Odessa began immediately, but it was marked by hardship and brutality. The city was heavily damaged, its infrastructure destroyed, and its population traumatized by months of siege. Food shortages and disease were rampant. Political repression followed swiftly as the Romanian authorities, working with German advisors and local collaborators, initiated purges, arrests, and reprisals. The NKVD had left behind networks of agents and partisans, and underground resistance would continue throughout the occupation. The siege of Odessa had ended, but its legacy was only beginning. It had become one of the defining episodes of the Eastern Front's southern campaign, a battle that showcased the determination of defenders, the limitations of coalition warfare, and the brutal realities of modern siege tactics. The experience would shape Romanian military policy, Soviet coastal defense strategies, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people caught in its path. The fall of Odessa marked a turning point in the southern theater of the Eastern Front, but the conclusion of the siege did not bring respite. Rather, it ushered in a new phase of occupation, repression, and strategic recalibration. While the Romanian army claimed victory, the cost was staggering, and the city that now lay under their control was battered, largely depopulated, and simmering with tension. The Romanian occupation of Odessa began in earnest on October 17, 1941. The entry of Romanian troops into the city revealed the full extent of the destruction left behind by the Soviet evacuation. Large portions of the harbor district were in ruins. Warehouses had been burned or demolished, key administrative buildings were reduced to rubble, and streets were littered with debris and unexploded ordnance. Soviet demolition crews had worked with ruthless precision to ensure the Axis would inherit little of strategic use. Despite the heavy losses suffered during the siege, Romanian forces moved swiftly to establish administrative control over the city. A military government was installed, and Odessa was incorporated into the Romanian annexed territory of Transnistria, a vast area between the Dniester and southern Bug rivers. General Gheorghe Podopeanu was appointed as the city's military governor. Romanian authorities declared the occupation a success and celebrated the operation as a demonstration of national resolve and military prowess. In practice, however, the Romanian grip on Odessa was precarious from the outset. The city remained unstable, and resistance, both active and passive, continued beneath the surface. The NKVD had deliberately left behind cells of agents tasked with coordinating sabotage and partisan activities. Underground presses, arms caches, and coded communication networks enabled continued Soviet influence within the city. The Romanian administration responded with harsh repression, determined to root out any remaining opposition. The most notorious event of the occupation occurred only a few days after the city's capture. On October 22, 1941, a massive explosion rocked the headquarters of the Romanian military command in Odessa, killing over 60 people, including General Glogogeanu, the city's interim governor. The explosion, planted by Soviet operatives in the building's basement prior to the evacuation, was a devastating psychological blow to Romanian forces. The attack enraged the Romanian High Command and triggered a brutal wave of reprisals. In response to the bombing, Romanian authorities initiated a campaign of mass executions. Thousands of residents, primarily Jews and suspected Soviet sympathizers, were arrested, detained in makeshift camps, and summarily executed. Entire families were rounded up and shot, their bodies dumped into mass graves or burned in abandoned warehouses. Historians estimate that between 2,000 and 25,000 people were killed in the reprisals over the following days. The massacre of Odessa remains one of the most horrifying episodes of Romanian involvement on the Eastern Front. These actions were carried out with the knowledge and participation of local military and police officials, and in some cases, with German SS involvement. The massacre was not only an act of vengeance, but part of a broader campaign of terror aimed at eradicating Jewish communities and political opposition in newly occupied territories. Odessa, which had once been a thriving, multicultural port city, saw its population decimated and its spirit broken. Beyond the violence, the Romanian occupation was marked by administrative challenges and logistical failures. The city's infrastructure was in a critical state, food supplies were limited, and public services barely functioned. The Romanian authorities lacked the resources and personnel to properly govern such a large urban center. Efforts were made to restore order, repair damage, and resume some basic civic functions, but progress was slow and uneven. Corruption and incompetence were widespread among the occupation bureaucracy. Meanwhile, resistance activity continued. Despite the terror unleashed in October, Soviet partisans remained active in and around Odessa. Rail lines were sabotaged, military depots were attacked, and informants within Romanian ranks passed intelligence back to Soviet contacts across the Black Sea. The Romanian garrison was forced to devote considerable manpower to security operations, patrols, and counterintelligence activities, further stretching an already depleted force. For the Romanian army, the siege and subsequent occupation of Odessa proved a sobering experience. The victory had come at a catastrophic cost, and the challenges of holding the city were greater than anticipated. Morale among Romanian soldiers remained low, particularly as winter set in and conditions in the occupied city deteriorated. Desertion, illness, and psychological fatigue took a toll, and many units stationed in Odessa were rotated out in early 1942 to recover. The Soviet leadership, while mourning the temporary loss of Odessa, considered the defense a strategic and moral triumph. The successful evacuation, the prolonged resistance, and the damage inflicted on the Romanian army had exceeded expectations. The defense of Odessa was publicized across the Soviet Union as a symbol of heroism and sacrifice. It boosted morale at a time when Soviet forces were reeling from defeats elsewhere, and provided a blueprint for future urban defenses. In the wider context of the war, the siege of Odessa demonstrated the difficulties of coalition warfare for the Axis. German reliance on Romanian forces exposed gaps in training, equipment, and operational doctrine. German commanders noted the limitations of Romanian logistics and questioned the effectiveness of future joint operations without direct German command and support. These concerns would resurface during the subsequent battles in Crimea and the Caucasus. The siege and occupation of Odessa were not isolated events, but part of the broader struggle for control of the Black Sea region. The city's fall was not the end of the war in the south. It was a stage in a long and bitter campaign that would continue to shape the trajectory of World War II for years to come. Odessa had resisted, endured, and been consumed by war. What followed was no less brutal than the siege itself: occupation, atrocity, and the slow, painful collapse of civilian life under military rule. The aftermath of Odessa's fall in October 1941 opened a long and difficult chapter in the city's wartime history, one not defined by grand military maneuvers, but by occupation, repression, and survival. While the guns of the siege had fallen silent, the trauma of war had merely shifted forms. The Romanian administration now faced the task of governing a devastated city and a population gripped by fear, grief, and quiet defiance. Incorporated into the Romanian-administered region of Transnistria, Odessa became the capital of this new occupation zone. Romanian authorities envisioned it as a permanent administrative and military hub, a showcase of their civilizing mission in the east. Plans were drawn for the reconstruction of the harbor, the establishment of Romanian institutions, and even the symbolic integration of Odessa into the Romanian national framework. Yet these ambitions collided almost immediately with the harsh realities on the ground. The city was on the brink of collapse. Public services were nearly non-existent. Water and electricity were sporadic. Thousands of buildings were in ruins or structurally unsound due to sustained shelling and deliberate demolition. The port, once a vital artery of Soviet commerce and naval power, was crippled. Most of the equipment had been destroyed or removed by the Soviets during the evacuation. Romanian engineers and workers tried to restore limited functionality, but lacked the machinery, manpower, and materials necessary for full recovery. Worse still was the humanitarian crisis unfolding among the population. Those who had not fled the city before or during the siege, largely the poor, the elderly, Jews, and other vulnerable groups, now faced starvation and disease. Food supplies were dangerously low. The German invasion had disrupted agricultural production across Ukraine, and the Axis logistical system was overstretched. What little grain was available was often requisitioned for military use or diverted to feed occupation personnel. Public health conditions deteriorated rapidly. Hospitals were overwhelmed, often lacking even basic supplies. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory diseases spread through the population, especially in the overcrowded slums and tenements that had survived the shelling. Romanian medical teams, ill-equipped and undertrained, were unable to contain the spread of illness. Burial services failed to keep pace with the rising death toll. In this atmosphere of deprivation, Romanian occupation forces implemented increasingly brutal policies aimed at maintaining control. Surveillance was constant. Any sign of resistance, whether real or imagined, was met with swift and violent repression. Street patrols, curfews, and mass identity checks became routine. Informers were recruited to identify suspected partisans or former Soviet officials. The remaining Jewish population lived under perpetual threat, subject to deportation, forced labor, or execution. The massacre that followed the October 22nd bombing had not ended the cycle of violence. It had inaugurated a new phase of terror. Executions continued sporadically throughout the winter, often in response to partisan actions or merely as acts of intimidation. Prison camps were established in and around the city. Many detainees died of exposure, malnutrition, or abuse before they could be interrogated. The occupation turned Odessa into a city of shadows, where silence and fear were essential to survival. Despite the repression, resistance did not disappear. Small partisan units, many of them coordinated by the NKVD, operated within the city and in the nearby countryside. Their activities ranged from disseminating propaganda leaflets to assassinating Romanian officers and sabotaging infrastructure. Soviet radio operators maintained secret contact with Moscow, relaying intelligence and receiving coded instructions. The most effective units used disguises, civilian covers, and the labyrinthine urban terrain to move undetected. Romanian counterinsurgency operations intensified. Dozens of villages surrounding Odessa were subjected to punitive raids. Suspected partisan supporters were arrested or deported. Entire communities were burned as warnings. These actions did little to eliminate the resistance, but succeeded in deepening local hatred toward the occupation. As the winter of 1941-42 set in, the Romanian army found itself in a war of attrition, not against a standing military opponent, but against a hostile land and people. Politically, the situation strained Romania's resources and exposed deep divisions within its leadership. Marshal Antonescu remained committed to the occupation of Transnistria and the Romanianization of Odessa, but many in Bucharest began to question the feasibility of this policy. The enormous cost of maintaining order in a ruined city, coupled with growing military obligations on the Eastern Front, led some Romanian politicians and generals to quietly advocate for withdrawal or German assumption of responsibility. German authorities, however, showed little interest in assuming direct control of Odessa. They viewed the city and surrounding region as a Romanian responsibility, both in terms of administration and supply. Occasional visits by German liaison officers and security advisors did little to shift the burden. In private correspondence, German officials expressed skepticism about Romanian governance capabilities, but acknowledged the usefulness of having a loyal ally absorb the cost and risk of occupation. By early 1942, the occupation of Odessa had become a symbol of contradiction, an apparent military triumph that had turned into a logistical and moral quagmire. The city, once envisioned as a springboard for Axis control of the Black Sea, had become a site of continuous unrest, suffering, and strategic ambiguity. Neither fully pacified nor decisively useful, Odessa hung in a suspended state between conquest and collapse. For the people who remained, whether as survivors, collaborators, or resistors, life in Odessa was defined by uncertainty. The city no longer belonged to its citizens. It was no longer a Soviet stronghold, nor had it truly become Romanian. Instead, it was a city under siege by its own occupiers, haunted by its past, ravaged by war, and suffocating under the weight of foreign rule. As the harsh winter of 1941-42 deepened over Odessa, the occupation settled into a grim routine. The initial chaos and violence following the city's capture gave way to a colder, more systematic control. Romanian forces remained in charge, but the daily demands of administration, security, and survival in a hostile urban environment began to outpace their capabilities. What had started as a strategic conquest was rapidly turning into a heavy burden, militarily, economically, and politically. The Romanian administration sought to consolidate its authority through a range of policies aimed at normalizing the occupation. Civil institutions were restructured, schools were reopened under Romanian curricula, and efforts were made to reintroduce elements of pre-Soviet cultural life. Romanian was declared the official language of the city, and Russian language signage was removed or defaced. Clergy from the Romanian Orthodox Church arrived in Odessa to replace or oversee local religious institutions, reflecting Bucharest's desire to reshape the cultural identity of the city along Romanian lines. Yet beneath these gestures, a far harsher reality remained. The local population, scarred by siege and repression, was not easily pacified. Food shortages persisted into the new year, with only meager rations available for most civilians. The black market flourished in the shadows, fueled by corruption within both Romanian military and civil ranks. Soldiers and officers frequently supplemented their income by trafficking food, fuel, and even permits for safe passage, turning survival into a matter of bribery and connections. The suffering of Odessa's Jewish population reached its nadir during these winter months. Following the October massacre, those who remained were confined to ghettos or deported to camps further inland in Transnistria. These deportations were carried out with ruthless efficiency. Families were given only minutes to pack belongings before being herded onto trains or forced to march through freezing conditions. Thousands perished during these journeys, either from cold, hunger, or execution by Romanian or German units along the way. Those who survived faced the horrific conditions of labor camps, where disease and starvation were rampant. Romanian policy in Odessa reflected the broader ideological objectives of the Antonescu regime, driven by anti-communism, anti-Semitism, and a belief in the ethnic cleansing of newly acquired territories. The occupation sought not only to punish perceived enemies, but to reshape the demographic and political landscape entirely. In this, Romania was acting in close ideological alignment with its German ally, even if its methods were often less industrial and more improvisational. Meanwhile, the military dimension of the occupation remained a constant concern. Though large-scale combat had ended with the evacuation of Soviet forces, Odessa was not secure. Sabotage and resistance operations continued with persistence. Rail lines leading into the city were regularly disrupted. Power stations and warehouses were targeted by small, mobile partisan units. Romanian supply convoys were ambushed along rural roads, and assassinations of occupation officials occurred sporadically, often without warning. In response, the Romanian military command invested heavily in internal security. New counterintelligence units were formed, and collaboration with German advisors intensified. Civilian informants were encouraged through financial incentives or threats. Raids on suspected safe houses were common, often resulting in mass arrests and summary executions. Entire city blocks were sealed off and searched, while rural villages suspected of aiding partisans faced collective punishment. Still, these measures failed to eliminate resistance. Soviet operatives maintained covert communication with partisan groups via radio and couriers operating through the Black Sea. Odessa remained symbolically important to the Soviet Union. Even in occupation, the city was invoked in Soviet propaganda as a heroic bastion that had held out against fascism. Messages from Moscow urged partisans to keep up the fight, promising that liberation would come. For Romanian troops garrisoned in the city, morale continued to decline. The bitter winter, the hostile civilian population, and the constant fear of attack eroded discipline. Desertions increased, particularly among conscripts from rural Romanian provinces who had little stake in the ideological goals of the campaign. Letters home, many intercepted by censors, revealed frustration, despair, and a sense that their sacrifices had not been rewarded with meaningful victory. The broader war was also beginning to shift. By early 1942, German forces had secured most of Crimea and were preparing for a major summer offensive into the Caucasus. This required the redeployment of Romanian units to other sectors, further stretching the already thin occupation force in Odessa. The garrison was reduced in size, and many of the more experienced units were rotated out, replaced by second-line troops and auxiliary formations with limited combat experience. These changes weakened the occupation's hold. While the Romanian government remained committed to retaining Odessa as part of its long-term vision for a greater Romania, the costs were becoming increasingly unsustainable. Each day in Odessa required manpower, fuel, supplies, and constant vigilance. In Bucharest, voices within the military and civilian administration began to question how long the situation could be maintained. Still, no major strategic decisions were taken. The Romanian regime, tied closely to Hitler's war aims, continued its participation on the Eastern Front with a growing sense of resignation. Odessa remained under occupation, but the dream of transforming it into a stable, integrated part of Romania seemed increasingly illusory. For the people of Odessa, the winter of 1941-42 was a season of hunger, cold, and quiet resistance. Every night brought the threat of arrest. Every morning brought another day of survival. Beneath the surface, a city once filled with music, trade, and laughter had become a place of whispers, fear, and endurance. And though the Red Army was still far away, the idea of return, of revenge and liberation, continued to grow in the minds of those who had endured both siege and subjugation. By the spring of 1942, Odessa remained firmly under Romanian occupation, but the veneer of control was increasingly fragile. What had been claimed as a triumph of national arms had, in practice, become a prolonged and costly burden, an open wound on Romania's military and administrative capacities. The city still bore the physical scars of siege and sabotage, and its psychological wounds had only deepened under the continued strain of repression, hunger, and political violence. Despite efforts to rebuild some civic structures, much of Odessa's economy remained paralyzed. Attempts by the Romanian authorities to restart industrial production had met with limited success. Most factories had been damaged during the fighting or sabotaged during the Soviet withdrawal. The technical workforce had been decimated by deportations, executions, and labor conscription. In many cases, the expertise required to run complex equipment simply no longer existed within the remaining population, and skilled Soviet technicians had either fled or refused to cooperate. Agricultural recovery in the surrounding region was similarly uneven. Romanian administrators had hoped to use Transnistria, including the fertile lands around Odessa, as a breadbasket to support both the occupation and their forces deployed further east. However, this ambition proved unrealistic. The previous year's harvest had been disrupted by war, and widespread looting during the invasion had left stores and livestock depleted. Moreover, forced collectivization under Soviet rule had already dismantled traditional farming structures, and now Romanian requisitions made agricultural recovery nearly impossible. Food insecurity continued to plague both civilians and occupying forces. Starvation became a real threat during the lean spring months of 1942. Soup kitchens and rationing systems were overwhelmed, and the black market remained the primary means of acquiring basic goods. Corruption flourished, with Romanian officials selling food supplies or trading in bribes for travel passes, work permits, or access to confiscated housing. Civilians, especially Jews and those without Romanian documentation, were often denied aid entirely. Meanwhile, the Romanian government sought to solidify its ideological and political vision for the region. Antonescu's administration viewed Odessa as a keystone in the broader project of a Romanian imperial zone in the east. Romanian language and culture were imposed in public life. Statues of Romanian national heroes were erected, and Orthodox religious institutions were encouraged to assert Romanian spiritual authority. Soviet monuments were torn down or defaced, and Ukrainian national identity, tolerated by the Germans elsewhere, was actively suppressed in Odessa by Romanian authorities. But these symbolic gestures did little to mask the administrative chaos beneath. The Romanian occupation relied heavily on improvised local collaboration, often selecting administrators from among the non-Russian, non-Jewish minorities, especially ethnic Romanians or Moldovans. Many of these collaborators lacked experience or legitimacy and were resented by the population. Some cooperated only to survive. Others used their positions to settle old scores or enrich themselves. The Romanian police and security apparatus, meanwhile, continued their policy of collective punishment in response to real or suspected partisan actions. By mid-1942, the partisan threat in and around Odessa had grown more sophisticated. Encouraged by signs of an impending Soviet counteroffensive on other fronts, underground cells became bolder in their operations. Railway sabotage increased, especially on lines feeding supplies toward Crimea and the lower Dnieper. Assassinations of Romanian officers and informants resumed after a lull during the winter months. The Soviet Union had begun to allocate more resources to organizing and supplying partisan activities in the south, and Odessa remained a strategic priority for these efforts. In response, the Romanians launched a new series of security sweeps, so-called pacification campaigns. These operations targeted entire neighborhoods suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Men of military age were detained en masse, and interrogations were frequently accompanied by torture. Collective reprisals, including executions and the destruction of civilian property, became common. The NKVD's remaining agents in Odessa operated under increasing risk, but managed to preserve fragmented communication lines to partisan cells in the surrounding oblast. Amid this climate of fear and uncertainty, a strange duality emerged in daily life. Odessa, under occupation, remained a functioning city in name. Schools operated under Romanian curricula. Some shops reopened. Newspapers were published in Romanian and censored Russian. Religious services were held. Yet behind the facade, the city remained deeply fractured. Families were missing fathers, sons, and neighbors. Entire buildings stood vacant or had been turned into prisons, headquarters, or storage depots. Rumors spread more quickly than official news, and hope lived only in whispers. For many Romanian soldiers stationed in Odessa, the occupation was no longer a campaign but a sentence. The promise of honor and advancement had faded, replaced by monotony, fear of ambush, and deepening homesickness. Letters sent home spoke of empty streets, unfriendly faces, and an invisible enemy that never seemed to sleep. Commanders struggled to enforce discipline among men who no longer understood why they remained in a city that seemed neither conquerable nor worth keeping. Back in Bucharest, debates intensified within the political and military leadership. The Romanian economy was stretched thin, its army increasingly dependent on German supplies and training, and its internal stability threatened by growing discontent over the war's length and cost. Antonescu remained publicly committed to the Axis cause and to the control of Transnistria, but in private, more pragmatic voices began questioning the strategic value of holding Odessa at all. The city, rather than becoming a jewel of conquest, had become a costly liability. At the same time, the wider war was shifting. German victories in the spring of 1942 in Kharkiv and the opening stages of Operation Blue gave the Axis hope of finally seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus. But for Romania, already drained by its commitments in Odessa and Crimea, this expansion of the front only deepened the strain. It became clear that, unless the war was won decisively and soon, every territory gained might have to be defended at immense cost, against not only Soviet armies, but against insurgency, cold, hunger, and the will of people who refused to accept defeat. Thus, as the summer of 1942 approached, Odessa remained under occupation, its streets quiet but tense, its buildings cracked and crumbling, its population subdued but not pacified. The Romanian flag flew over the port and the city center, but beneath it lay a population that waited, endured, and remembered. By the late summer of 1942, the occupation of Odessa entered a phase defined less by movement than by stagnation, a bitter stillness marked by fatigue, fear, and foreboding. The initial fire of conquest had long been extinguished, and in its place stood a weary and contested silence. For the Romanian authorities, the city remained a logistical drain and a security liability. For the residents, Odessa had become a cage, surrounded not by walls, but by checkpoints, curfews, and watchful eyes. The strategic significance of Odessa, so hotly contested during the siege of 1941, had steadily declined in the grander scale of the Eastern Front. The German summer offensive of 1942 had shifted the war's center of gravity towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The Black Sea coast, while still relevant, was no longer the focal point of Axis planning. German interest in the administration of Transnistria and Odessa waned, and Romanian forces found themselves increasingly isolated, left to manage an increasingly unmanageable occupation alone. The daily reality for Romanian soldiers and administrators was one of erosion, of resources, morale, and hope. Supplies arrived irregularly. Requests for reinforcements or support were either delayed or denied. Recurrent illness and mounting psychological strain affected both rank and file and officers. What had once been touted as a national triumph now resembled a quiet, slow bleed, unacknowledged in propaganda, but impossible to ignore on the ground. Among the Romanian public, war fatigue had taken root. The death toll from the siege of Odessa and the subsequent occupation was difficult to conceal. Letters from the front painted grim pictures. The promised spoils of empire had failed to materialize. Economic hardship at home worsened. Antonescu's regime, though still tightly in control, began facing cracks in its carefully maintained facade. Intellectuals, politicians, and even segments of the military privately questioned the wisdom of continued expansion and occupation. Within Odessa, resistance continued, not with grand gestures, but with endurance. Underground cells remained active, transmitting intelligence to Soviet command, distributing clandestine pamphlets, and offering quiet acts of defiance. Some civilians engaged in passive resistance, refusing to speak Romanian, hiding fugitives, or sabotaging small infrastructure tasks. Even children scrawled anti-occupation slogans on walls and alleyways. The spirit of the city, though battered, remained defiantly alive. By 1943, the tide of the war had turned definitively. The catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet advance westward. Red Army victories in the Donbass and along the Dnieper River brought Soviet forces closer to the southern reaches of Ukraine. Odessa, once at the frontier of Axis expansion, now stood on the edge of a looming Soviet counteroffensive. The occupiers knew it. So did the occupied. Romanian leadership was caught in a trap of its own making. Having invested enormous political and military capital in the conquest and retention of Odessa, they could not easily withdraw without a public humiliation. Yet holding the city against a determined Soviet return would be nearly impossible. Resources were drained. Manpower was insufficient. The broader war effort demanded redeployment elsewhere. In the city, anxiety grew. Surveillance intensified. Executions of suspected partisans increased. Romanian garrisons prepared fallback positions. Mines were laid along key roads. But the sense of control was already slipping away. Rumors of the Red Army's advance spread quickly. Whispers of liberation or revenge echoed in streets still marked by shellfire and suffering. When Soviet forces finally began their push toward Odessa in early 1944, they did so with overwhelming force. The German and Romanian fronts were collapsing across southern Ukraine. The Axis retreat from Transnistria became inevitable. Romanian troops, worn out and demoralized, offered limited resistance. By April 10, 1944, the Red Army entered Odessa, reclaiming the city after more than 2.5 years of occupation. They found a city changed, its population reduced, its buildings scarred, its Jewish community nearly extinguished, its factories dormant. Yet its soul, shaped by siege, terror, and quiet rebellion, remained. Odessa had survived not only the Axis siege, but also the long and brutal occupation that followed. The story of the siege of Odessa in 1941 and its aftermath is more than a tale of military conflict. It is a chronicle of endurance, of complex loyalties, and of the devastating cost of imperial ambition. It reveals the limits of power imposed by geography, resistance, and human will. And it stands as a testament to the suffering and resilience of one of the Eastern Front's most embattled cities, a place that refused to surrender, even after its defenders had withdrawn.